My dears, I don't believe I've ever told you this story," Miss Marple began, her voice like soft lace brushing against old wood. She looked over at Raymond and Joyce, her eyes full of quiet affection. It was quite some time ago now. A curious little affair, really. Nothing too grand, of course. And I do hope you won't think I'm being vain in sharing it. She paused, fingers gently wrapping around her teacup, as if the warmth in her hands helped unlock the memory. You see, compared to you bright young things, I've never considered myself clever in the slightest. Raymond, with his brilliant novels, full of those troubled modern souls, all so complicated and brooding. And Eugene, with his bold, striking paintings, those abstract figures with strange little bulges and sharp corners. So very clever. Her smile was wistful, amused. I can't say I always understand them, mind you, but I admire them, I do. And yet, she leaned in just slightly, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Sometimes the quiet little things, the things people miss, can lead to the most astonishing truths. And this story, well, it was just such a thing. "Oh, but only because he's quite the kindest of nephews," Miss Marple said with a modest smile, brushing a bit of lint from her skirt. "He always says it so gently that I'm hopelessly Victorian, and I dare say he's right. I still adore the works of Mr. Alma Tadema and Sir Frederick Leighton, you know? All that beauty and order. I imagine to your eyes it must all seem so terribly outdated." She gave a little laugh, soft and almost shy, then looked down into her teacup for a moment, collecting her thoughts. Now, where was I? Oh, yes, I didn't mean to sound vain. Really, I didn't. But, well, I must admit I felt just the tiniest bit proud of myself, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Because, and I don't mean to boast, I do believe I managed to make sense of something that had all the clever people quite stumped. She looked up again, eyes twinkling with quiet satisfaction. And the funny thing is, it all seemed rather obvious to me from the very beginning. Just a matter of common sense, really, and a little bit of listening. "Well then," Miss Marple said softly, folding her hands in her lap, "let me tell you my little story." There was a delicate glimmer in her eyes, not of pride exactly, but of someone who remembers having truly made a difference, in her quiet, unassuming way. And if, along the way, I sound the slightest bit conceited, I do hope you'll forgive me. It's only because, well, I did manage to help someone in terrible distress. And when you've truly eased another person's suffering, it does leave a small warmth in your heart, doesn't it? She paused, her voice gentle, the memory settling in like dust on a windowsill. It all began one evening, just after 9 o'clock, I remember. Gwen. Oh, you must remember Gwen, my little maid with the fiery red hair and the big kind eyes. She came in and said that Mr. Patrick and a gentleman had arrived asking to see me. Miss Marple's brows lifted slightly in memory, amused at the formality of it all. She'd shown them into the drawing room quite properly. She was always so mindful of manners, that girl. I, of course, was still sitting in the dining room. In early spring, you see, I find it so much cozier in there. The drawing room can be quite drafty in the evenings, and the dining room holds the warmth like an old friend. She smiled then, more to herself than anyone else, as if the scene had returned to her not just in image, but in feeling. It always felt a bit wasteful. You know, having 2 fires going at once, Miss Marple said, adjusting the edge of a doily with her fingertips, her voice wrapped in gentle practicality. So I told Gwen to bring in the cherry brandy and a few glasses, the good ones, of course, and then I quickly made my way back into the drawing room. There was a softness in her expression, touched with the ache of memory. I don't know if you remember Mr. Patrick. He passed away 2 years ago now. she said quietly, as if speaking his name brought him closer for a moment. He'd been a dear friend for many, many years, and not just a friend. He handled all my legal affairs, you see. A sharp mind, that one, very shrewd, very steady. He had a way of listening that made you feel safe, as though no detail, however small, would escape him. She folded her hands, as though holding on to something more than just memory. His son looks after my business now. A good boy, really. Very proper, very modern. But somehow, well, I don't quite have that same sense of quiet confidence I always had with Mr. Patrick. There was something reassuring in his manner, like an old oak tree, solid and unmoving in any storm. She gave a small sigh, the kind that slips out when fondness and loss sit quietly side by side. Anyway, I began to explain to Mr. Patrick about the matter that had brought them to my door. As soon as I mentioned the fires, Miss Marple continued, her voice warm and nostalgic, Mr. Patrick insisted, ever so kindly, that he and his friend would come into the dining room instead. Always so thoughtful he was, never one to let anyone go to trouble. She paused a moment, her eyes drifting slightly, as if seeing it all again. That's when he introduced me to his friend, Mr. Rhodes, a younger man, not much past 40, I'd say. But the moment I looked at him, I knew something wasn't right. He had that look, a tightness in the jaw, eyes that wouldn't quite settle. There was a stillness in him, but not the peaceful kind, the kind that comes from holding something too heavy, too long. Her expression softened with compassion. His manner was, well, one might have called it abrupt, perhaps even rude if you weren't paying attention. But I saw it plain as day. The poor man was under some terrible strain. It clung to him like a fog. She gently traced the rim of her teacup before continuing. Once we'd all settled into the dining room and Gwen had brought in the cherry brandy. Bless her, always so efficient. Mr. Patrick turned to me, his voice lower now, more serious. And he said, "Miss Marple, I hope you'll forgive an old friend for what I'm about to ask." Her voice lingered there, wrapped in memory and something deeper, the moment just before a story truly begins. "Now, I hope you won't mind me taking a bit of a liberty," Mr. Patrick had said, with that careful tone people use when they're about to ask something difficult. "But what I've come for is, well, a consultation." Miss Marple paused in her storytelling, a gentle crease in her brow. At first, I couldn't make heads or tails of what he meant, she admitted. "Consultation? I'm no doctor, certainly not a solicitor or a detective." But he went on, quite seriously. He said, "In a case of illness, one often wants 2 points of view, that of the specialist and that of the family physician. Now, it's fashionable these days to put all one's faith in the specialist. But I'm not so sure that's always best. The specialist knows one field and knows it thoroughly, but the family doctor, he may know a little less, yet his experience is wider, broader." Miss Marple smiled softly, that quiet, knowing smile of hers. And I understood exactly what he meant. Not long before that, one of my nieces had rushed her little boy off to a rather famous skin specialist. Very highly recommended, of course. Frightfully expensive, too. But you know, in all his technical brilliance, he'd quite missed what the child truly needed: a little less sugar and a lot more sunshine. She folded her hands gently, her tone growing tender. "Sometimes it isn't the cleverest person in the room who sees the heart of the matter. It's the one who's been quietly watching, quietly listening. The one who sees the whole picture, not just the details." "His poor wife didn't even think to consult her own doctor," Miss Marple said gently, her voice tinged with quiet concern. "She thought of him as old-fashioned, a bit of a dodderer, really, and instead rushed straight to the specialist. One of those very grand names, the sort that's always written up in glossy magazines. She gave a small, regretful shake of her head. He prescribed a rather costly treatment, ointments and diets and whatnot, and only after all that, it turned out the child had nothing more than a rather unusual case of measles. Ordinary, really, once you looked at it clearly. Miss Marple gave a faint smile, though there was no pride in it, only a quiet sense of understanding. I only mentioned it, and I do apologize for digressing. I always mean not to. But I wanted Mr. Patrick to know that I understood what he was trying to say about second opinions, about trusting the wider view. She paused, her fingers curling lightly around her teacup. But truthfully, even then, I still had no idea what he was leading up to. She glanced down, as if reliving the moment, and then looked up again, her eyes a little sad. "If Mr. Rhodes is ill," I began, tentatively, wanting to be kind, wanting to be careful with the words. And that's when he gave the most dreadful laugh, the kind that doesn't come from amusement at all, but from something hollow, something frightened. Miss Marple's voice dropped to a whisper. "Ill?" he said. "No, Miss Marple. I expect to die of a broken neck in a few days' time." It wasn't until some months later that the whole thing began to make sense, Miss Marple said softly, her voice drifting like a thought half remembered. There had been a murder, rather a dreadful one, in a town called Branches, about 20 miles from here. She hesitated, then gave a faint, almost apologetic smile. "I must confess, at the time, I hadn't paid it much mind. I know that sounds terribly shallow, considering the gravity of such a thing. But you see, our little village was going through a bit of a stir of its own. There was all sorts of excitement about our district nurse, a perfectly lovely woman. But she had taken to wearing trousers and riding a motorbike, which caused quite the flutter in the parish." Miss Marple chuckled softly, then sighed with affection. "Villages are like that, I'm afraid. The world can be quaking on the other side of the globe. Earthquakes in India, scandals in London, even a woman stabbed in a hotel just a few towns over. And still, what truly captures our attention is whether Mrs. Sims is going to let that awful Mr. Draycott paint her gate bright blue." She paused again. Then her eyes grew more serious, the twinkle giving way to something thoughtful. "Still, I did recall reading something about it. A woman, alone in her hotel room, stabbed. It seemed so distant then, just a column in the paper. But now, in the quiet of that evening, with Mr. Rhodes sitting across from me, pale and broken, it all suddenly felt very close. I hadn't remembered the woman's name at the time," Miss Marple said softly, her voice touched with regret. "It was just another sad article in the newspaper. Tragic, yes, but distant. Until that moment. When Mr. Patrick told me the truth." She paused, her fingers gently smoothing the folds of her skirt, as if trying to steady herself. "That poor woman, the one who had been murdered in that hotel room. She had been Mr. Rhodes' wife." The words settled heavily in the room, and for a moment, Miss Marple's voice faltered with the weight of it. As if that weren't dreadful enough, Mr. Rhodes was under suspicion himself, not just whispered about, mind you, but truly believed by some to be the one who had killed her. She looked down, her expression tender, almost maternal. Mr. Patrick explained it all so carefully, so gently, trying to soften the blow of each word. He said the coroner's jury had returned a verdict of murder by person or persons unknown. But even with that, Mr. Rhodes believed, and with good reason, I gathered, that he would likely be arrested in a matter of days. Miss Marple took a quiet breath, her voice steadying. He had come to Mr. Patrick, placing everything, his name, his future, his very freedom in his hands. And Mr. Patrick, calm and loyal as ever, had taken on that burden without hesitation. She paused, then added, with a touch of reverence. That very afternoon, they had gone to consult Sir Malcolm Old. Her voice faded for a moment, not for drama, but because some truths are simply too heavy to speak quickly. After that, Miss Marple continued, her voice soft but unwavering, they went to see Sir Malcolm Old, K.C., a young man, Mr. Patrick told me, with all the latest methods and no shortage of confidence. She paused, gently resting her teacup on its saucer, her eyes reflecting both admiration and concern. Sir Malcolm had already been briefed to defend Mr. Rhodes in court, should the affair ever reach trial. He'd suggested a line of defense, neat, logical, polished. But Mr. Patrick, ever the wise and loyal friend, wasn't entirely convinced. Miss Marple leaned forward a little, as though sharing a secret. "You see, my dear lady," Mr. Patrick said to me, "Sir Malcolm approaches this case like a true specialist. He's given a brilliant weapon to a soldier and asked him to charge straight ahead. But the trouble with a specialist's view is its single-mindedness. You hand him a problem, and he sees only one solution, the most likely line of defense. Yet even the most elegant argument can fail to touch the heart of a matter." She sighed, a gentle, compassionate sound. "And I understood exactly what he meant. Sometimes it's not the cleverest plan that wins the day, but the one that sees the whole picture, the one that remembers the human being at its center." He said something then that stayed with me. Miss Marple continued gently, her voice quiet but steady, that the entire defense, brilliant though it might be, overlooked what he called the vital point. It didn't take into account what had actually happened, not the facts, not the truth as it unfolded in real time, just a tidy theory meant to fit a courtroom. She looked down for a moment, the corners of her mouth lifting in a modest smile. Then, and I must say, it was very kind of him, he said some rather flattering things about me, about my little bit of insight, my sense of people, my understanding of human nature. He was very gracious, really. And then he asked if he might tell me the full story, in the hope that I might see something they had perhaps missed. Miss Marple paused, glancing thoughtfully toward the window, as though remembering the weight of that moment. I could tell, of course, that Mr. Rhodes wasn't at all pleased. He looked skeptical, almost irritated, really, as though he'd been dragged into some sort of tea-time parlor game. He didn't believe for a second that an elderly lady sitting in a rose-colored drawing room could be of any use to him. She gave a soft, almost amused sigh. But Mr. Patrick, well, he knew better. He ignored Mr. Rhodes' impatience completely, and without another word of hesitation, he began to tell me what had happened. On the night of March the... Her voice softened again, the tone shifting, as if the true heart of the story was finally about to begin. "It was the night of March the 8th, Miss Marple began softly, the words carrying a gentle gravity. Mr. and Mrs. Rhodes had been staying at the Crown Hotel in Manchester. Not an especially grand place, but respectable enough. She folded her hands delicately, her eyes reflecting a thoughtful kind of sadness. From the way Mr. Patrick spoke, choosing his words ever so carefully, I gathered that Mrs. Rhodes may have had, well, a tendency to be just a touch of a hypochondriac. Poor thing. Always a little too aware of her nerves, perhaps. She'd gone up to bed straight after dinner, not feeling quite herself." Miss Marple gave a small sigh, touched with compassion. The two of them had adjoining rooms with a door connecting them. Rather sensible, really. Mr. Rhodes, it seems, had stayed up in his room to work. He was writing a book, you see, something quite scholarly, on prehistoric flints. Very dry, I should think, but clearly something he cared about deeply. She glanced to the side, as if seeing the scene in her mind. At around 11 o'clock, after tidying up his papers, he decided it was time to call it a night. But before he got into bed, he did what any decent husband might do. He popped his head into his wife's room, just to check if she needed anything. A glass of water, perhaps, or an extra blanket. Her voice slowed, the tone dimming to a quiet unease. But what he found, I imagine, was nothing he could have ever expected. "He found the light still on," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice dipped in sorrow. "And his wife lying there in bed, perfectly still, a dark stain blooming through her nightdress. She had been stabbed, straight through the heart." She paused for a moment, letting the weight of that image settle, not for drama, but out of respect for the life that had been lost. "Mr. Patrick said the doctor later determined she had been dead for at least an hour. Likely longer." Miss Marple's eyes dimmed slightly, her voice laced with thoughtfulness. There were certain facts that stood out. The door to the corridor, the one in Mrs. Rhodes's room, was locked and bolted from the inside. The only window was shut, latched, and untouched. According to Mr. Rhodes, no one had come through his room either, not a soul except the chambermaid, and only briefly. She had brought hot water bottles, nothing more. Miss Marple gave a small, thoughtful nod. The weapon used was a stiletto dagger, a narrow little thing, sharp and cruel. It had been on Mrs. Rhodes's dressing table. She apparently used it as a paper knife. She folded her hands quietly. There were no fingerprints on it, not a single one. She let that fact linger for a moment. In the end, the situation boiled down to something quite chilling. No one but Mr. Rhodes and the chambermaid had been in or near the room where Mrs. Rhodes was killed. Miss Marple glanced upward, the calm stillness in her voice tinged now with quiet curiosity. "I asked about the chambermaid. Of course I did. That was the first thread to pull." "Her name's Mary Hill," Mr. Patrick said. "Local girl, been working at the Crown for over 10 years. Not a mark on her record. And truly, there seems no earthly reason why she'd suddenly decide to stab a guest in her bed." Miss Marple hesitated, then added gently, "He did say she was, well, extraordinarily stupid. Not unkindly, but as a simple truth. The sort of girl who struggles to spell her own name, let alone plan a murder." She sighed. "And yet, in these matters, it is always best not to underestimate anyone, not even the dullest soul in the room. She's rather simple-minded, poor girl," Miss Marple said gently, her voice full of that quiet compassion she reserved even for those the world overlooked. "Half-witted, some might call her, not unkindly, but plainly." She folded her hands slowly. Her story, however, has never changed. She brought Mrs. Rhodes her hot water bottle, as she always did, and says the poor lady was already half asleep, drowsy, drifting off under the weight of the day. And frankly, I don't believe she had anything to do with the crime. Neither did Mr. Patrick, and he said, quite rightly, I think, that no jury in their right mind would believe it either. Miss Marple paused, her brow furrowing ever so slightly, as she remembered the next part, the layout, the strange choreography of footsteps and silence in that old hotel. Mr. Patrick mentioned a few more details that struck me as rather important. At the top of the stairs in the Crown Hotel, there's a small lounge, more of an alcove really, where guests sometimes sit to have coffee or read the paper. From there, a corridor runs off to the right. At the end of that corridor is the door to Mr. Rhodes's room. Let's call it Door A. She gently tapped her teacup, as if arranging things in her mind. Now, just past that, The corridor takes a sharp turn to the right again, and there, around the corner, is door B, the entrance to Mrs. Rhodes's room. Miss Marple leaned in a little, her voice dropping slightly as though inviting her listener to lean in too. As it happened, both doors could be seen, quite clearly, by witnesses that evening. Door A, the one to Mr. Rhodes's room, was in plain view of 4 people, 2 commercial travelers and an elderly married couple, all sitting in that little lounge having coffee. And not one of them saw anyone enter or leave that room, except Mr. Rhodes himself and the chambermaid. She paused again. As for door B, the one to Mrs. Rhodes's room, well, there was an electrician working nearby. He was repairing some wiring, and he swore just as firmly that no one passed through that door either, save the same chambermaid. Miss Marple sat back ever so slightly, her eyes thoughtful. And so, you see, every path to and from that room was watched, and yet, somehow, someone entered and killed her. It really was the most curious case, Miss Marple said softly, her eyes clouded with thought. Strange and troubling, and on the surface of it, well, it seemed almost certain that Mr. Rhodes had killed his wife. She paused delicately, her voice never rushing. And yet, I could tell that Mr. Patrick didn't believe that for a moment. Not deep down. And you see, Mr. Patrick was not a man to be easily misled. He had one of those minds, sharp, steady, not swayed by emotion or appearances. If he believed in Mr. Rhodes's innocence, then I felt there had to be more to the story than met the eye. She folded her hands gently in her lap and continued. At the inquest, Mr. Rhodes had spoken, though not well, I'm afraid. He stumbled through his words, offered some vague and rather rambling explanation about a mysterious woman who had been sending threatening letters to his wife. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, sadness in her expression. Apparently, the story was not well received. It sounded muddled and unconvincing, and I gather that even the coroner looked at him with skepticism. She drew in a quiet breath. But when Mr. Patrick asked him again, away from the court, in confidence, Mr. Rhodes was more honest. He said, quite plainly, I never believed any of it. Her voice softened with understanding. You see, Mrs. Rhodes, Amy, was, by her husband's account, one of those unfortunate people who, well, embroidered life, a romantic liar, I suppose one might say, the kind who spins every slip, every spark, into a tale of danger and drama. Miss Marple gave a faint, wistful smile. In her telling, the smallest incident became an epic. A near fall on a banana peel turned into a miraculous escape from death. If a lampshade caught fire, she hadn't just blown it out. She'd survived a blazing inferno, rescued by fate and sheer bravery. She paused, letting the truth of that sink in. Her husband, it seems, had grown so used to her dramatics that he stopped listening altogether. So when she told him about some mysterious woman making threats, he simply assumed it was more nonsense, a childish story, an invention. Miss Marple leaned back slightly, her voice now tinged with quiet sadness. And perhaps that was his greatest mistake. She once told him, Miss Marple said gently, that years ago she had injured a woman in a motor accident, and that this woman had sworn revenge. But Mr. Rhodes, he hadn't paid her much attention. You see, the incident had taken place before they were even married, and although she'd read him some wildly dramatic letters, full of strange, almost unhinged threats, he'd always suspected she'd written them himself. Miss Marple sighed, not with judgment, but with quiet understanding. She had done that sort of thing before, he said, once or twice. Amy Rhodes was the kind of woman who lived for excitement, or perhaps more truthfully, needed it. She was prone to nerves, given to wild exaggeration, and always longing for drama. Her voice softened further, touched by familiarity. And I must say, I didn't find that at all hard to believe. We have a young woman in the village who behaves in very much the same way, always fainting over nothing, always hinting that someone is secretly plotting against her. The poor soul just wants to feel important, to be at the center of things. She leaned forward slightly, her tone now tinged with sorrow. The danger, of course, is when something truly extraordinary happens to people like that. No one believes them. Their truth gets lost under the weight of their own make-believe. And I couldn't help but feel that this was exactly what had happened to Mrs. Rhodes. Miss Marple paused, then added gently, "The police, I gathered, thought Mr. Rhodes was simply inventing a story, a desperate and rather feeble attempt to point suspicion elsewhere." She looked up thoughtfully. "I asked then whether any women had been staying alone at the hotel. And yes, there were two. One was a Mrs. Grumby, an Anglo-Indian widow. The other, a Miss Carruthers, a rather loud, horsey sort of spinster who dropped her G's and spoke her mind with great enthusiasm." Miss Marple allowed herself a faint, knowing smile. Mr. Patrick added that even the most minor details had been looked into. Nothing had been overlooked, and yet something still didn't quite fit. The inquiries, Miss Marple continued gently, hadn't turned up a single witness who'd seen either woman, Mrs. Granby or Miss Carruthers, anywhere near the scene of the crime. And, as Mr. Patrick explained, there wasn't a scrap of evidence to link either of them to what had happened. No motive, no opportunity, not even the faintest thread. She tilted her head, thinking. So I asked him, very quietly, if he could describe them to me. Sometimes, you see, it's not what people do, but what they are that gives you a sense of things. Mrs. Granby, he said, was around 50. Sallow complexion, reddish hair always a little untidy, the sort of woman, I imagined, who didn't care much for mirrors. Her clothes, he told me, were rather flamboyant. Native silks and shawls, the kind of style that always seems a bit too bright for English weather. Miss Marple gave a tiny smile, not unkindly. Miss Carruthers, on the other hand, was closer to 40, businesslike, wore her hair cropped short like a man's, and dressed the same way too. Plain, sensible jackets and skirts. Nothing soft about her. She gave a small sigh. "Dear me," I said quietly, "that makes it all very difficult." Mr. Patrick looked at me then, rather sharply, I think, as though he suspected I might be holding something back. And I was. But I didn't want to speak just yet, not until the thought had settled fully in my mind. So instead, she continued, I asked what Sir Malcolm Old had said. Miss Marple gave a faint nod. Sir Malcolm, as ever, was confident. He believed he could bring in conflicting medical evidence and explain away the lack of fingerprints. One of those clever barristers, all logic and no heart. Then I turned to Mr. Rhodes, she said, her voice now laced with gentleness, and I asked him quietly what he believed. She paused, her eyes reflecting the honesty of the moment. "Doctors are all fools," he said bluntly. But then his voice softened. "No, I don't think she killed herself. Amy wasn't that kind of woman." Miss Marple folded her hands slowly, thoughtfully. And I believed him. For all her hysterics and fantasy and drama, women like that crave attention, not silence. They don't vanish quietly. They want the world to watch them suffer, not to leave it behind in stillness. I sat quietly for a moment, thinking it all over, Miss Marple said, her voice low and reflective. And then I asked, as casually as I could, whether the door from Mrs. Rhodes' room led directly into the corridor. "No," said Mr. Rhodes. "There was a small hallway, a kind of private passage, with a bathroom and lavatory. It was the door from her bedroom into that little hallway that had been locked and bolted from the inside." Miss Marple nodded gently, her eyes growing distant, her mind arranging the pieces. "Well then," I said, as lightly as I could manage, "that makes the whole thing rather simple, doesn't it?" She gave a modest little smile. And really it did. The most straightforward thing in the world, almost childishly obvious once you saw it. And yet no one else had. No one had looked at it quite that way. She paused, then chuckled softly. Mr. Patrick and Mr. Rhodes were both staring at me, quite openly, and I felt myself coloring like a schoolgirl. It was most uncomfortable. "Perhaps," Mr. Rhodes said, in that polite but faintly patronizing way men often use when they think a woman has got ahead of herself, "Miss Marple hasn't quite appreciated the complexities of the case." "Oh, I think I have," I said quietly. Miss Marple folded her hands gently in her lap and continued, voice serene and clear. "There are only 4 possibilities. Either Mrs. Rhodes was killed by her husband, or by the chambermaid, or she took her own life, or she was murdered by someone from the outside, someone no one saw enter or leave." She paused, her gaze soft but unwavering. "That's impossible," Mr. Rhodes interrupted, growing agitated. "No one could have come through my room without my noticing. And even if they somehow slipped into my wife's room without the electrician seeing, how could they leave again and lock the door behind them from the inside?" Miss Marple's eyes grew still. "That," she said softly, "was exactly the question." Mr. Patrick looked at me then, kindly, almost encouragingly, and said, "Well, Miss Marple?" I hesitated a moment. "I'd like," I said, "to ask a question." I turned to Mr. Rhodes. "What did the chambermaid look like?" He looked slightly taken aback. "Well, I'm not quite sure," he said slowly. "She was tallish, I think. I can't really remember if she was fair or dark." So I turned to Mr. Patrick and asked him the same question. He answered more precisely. "Medium height, fairish hair, blue eyes, rather a high color." Mr. Rhodes laughed softly. "You're a better observer than I am, Patrick." But I shook my head gently. "I don't think so." Then I asked them both another question. "Can either of you describe the maid in my house, the one who let you in this evening?" They glanced at each other, surprised, and then both admitted they couldn't. "Don't you see what that means?" I said, my voice quiet but firm. "You both came here thinking only of your own business, caught up in worry and urgency. The girl who opened the door was invisible to you, just part of the scenery. A uniform, an apron, nothing more." I looked at Mr. Rhodes. "That's what happened at the hotel too. You were focused on your work. You saw the maid's outfit, but not the woman wearing it." Then I turned to Mr. Patrick. "You, however, spoke to her, interviewed her, looked at her properly. You saw a person, not just a role." I leaned forward just a little. "And that's exactly what the woman who committed the murder counted on. That no one really sees a maid, not unless they're looking." They still stared at me, uncertain. So I went on, gently. "I believe this is how it happened. The chambermaid, or someone dressed as her, entered through door A. She passed right through Mr. Rhodes's room," Miss Marple said softly, "just as the real chambermaid would have, carrying a hot water bottle, calm and unremarkable, and entered Mrs. Rhodes's room. After a moment, she exited again through the private hallway and into passage V. Her eyes darkened slightly. But X, our murderer, she didn't come through the same way. She came in from the other side, through door B, into that little hallway. And then she waited. Miss Marple's voice was calm, but there was a certain stillness in the room now, the kind of stillness that settles just before something important is said. She hid in one of the side rooms, a lavatory most likely, and she waited until the chambermaid had gone. Then, when the coast was clear, she slipped into Mrs. Rhodes's room, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she continued, gentle but unwavering. She took the stiletto from the dressing table. Oh, yes, she would have explored the room earlier in the day, memorized every inch of it. She crept to the bedside and stabbed that poor, drowsy woman through the heart. There was no anger in her voice, only quiet sorrow. She wiped the handle clean. Then she locked and bolted the door behind her, the door she had entered through. And finally, she left through the one place no one would suspect, through your room, Mr. Rhodes. Mr. Rhodes stared at her, stunned. But I would have seen her, and the electrician would have seen her enter. Miss Marple simply shook her head. No, that's exactly where you're mistaken. She let the silence settle like a light snowfall before she continued. You wouldn't have noticed her. Not if she was wearing a chambermaid's uniform. Not if she moved quickly and calmly, exactly as the real maid had done moments before. Her voice softened even further. You were deep in your work. At best, you saw a figure in uniform move through the room. In your mind, it was the same woman, same apron, same cap, same routine. But it wasn't. She looked at him with gentle finality. That's what the people having coffee saw too, a chambermaid go in. And a chambermaid come out. But it wasn't the same chambermaid, just the same dress. That, you see, was the trick. And the electrician, Miss Marple went on, well, he saw the same thing. A chambermaid went in. And a chambermaid came out. That's all he noticed. She gave a slight shrug, full of understanding. Of course, if the maid had been very pretty, perhaps one of the gentlemen might have remembered her face, human nature being what it is. But if she was just an ordinary, middle-aged woman, no one sees her. Not really. They see the uniform, not the person inside it. Mr. Rhodes leaned forward, his voice tight with emotion. But then, who was she? Miss Marple looked at him gently, almost regretfully. Well, that's the tricky part, isn't it? It must have been either Mrs. Granby or Miss Carruthers. She folded her hands, her tone calm and sure. Mrs. Granby, she said thoughtfully, with her flamboyant scarves and silks, it wouldn't surprise me if she usually wore a wig. In that case, she might have simply taken it off, tucked her hair up sensibly, and appeared as the chambermaid. But on the other hand, she added, Miss Carruthers, with her sharp voice and cropped mannish haircut, she might just as easily have put on a wig. Either disguise would have worked. Miss Marple smiled faintly. You'll find out which one it was easily enough, I'm sure. But for my part, I always rather suspected Miss Carruthers. She leaned back slightly, her voice softening with finality. And really, my dears, that is the end of the story. Her voice grew gentler, touched with melancholy. Miss Carruthers, as it turned out, was a false name. But she was the right woman. There had been madness in her family, a dark thread running deep. Mrs. Rhodes, you see, was a reckless driver, rather infamous for it. She had once struck a little girl in the road. Miss Marple looked down, her voice now low and full of sorrow. That child was Miss Carruthers' daughter. The blow didn't just take the girl, it shattered the mother too. It drove her out of her mind, though she hid it well. Very well. She looked up again, steady now. Her madness was clever, quiet. cold. It waited and it planned. And then one day, it dressed itself in an apron and knocked on the door with a hot water bottle. Other than the string of disturbingly unhinged letters she'd written to her victim, she'd kept her madness tightly tucked beneath the surface, Miss Marple said quietly, her eyes misted with a mix of pity and clarity. She'd been following poor Mrs. Rhodes for quite some time, watching, waiting, planning. She shook her head softly. And her plan? Well, it was clever, chillingly clever. She'd posted the false hair and chambermaid's dress to herself days in advance, tucked away in a parcel, all carefully arranged. And the very next morning, after it all came to light, and she was gently confronted, she broke down entirely, admitted to it all. Her voice dropped with compassion. The poor soul is in Broadmoor now, entirely unbalanced, of course, a brilliant mind bent tragically out of shape. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Mr. Patrick came by a few days later, brought me a letter from Mr. Rhodes. So kind, really. It made me blush. Said I had saved his life. She paused, brushing an invisible crumb from her skirt. Then my dear Mr. Patrick, always the gentleman, asked me something that had been puzzling him. Just one thing, he said. Why did you think it was more likely to be Miss Carruthers than Mrs. Granby? You'd never seen either of them. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled then, the faintest gleam of mischief in her voice. Ah, I said, it was the cheese. She let the silence hang for just a moment before explaining, in that gentle, matter-of-fact way of hers. You said she dropped her cheese. Now that's the sort of thing hunting people say in books all the time. I dropped my cheese. She left her G's. That sort of talk. But in real life, I've never heard anyone under 60 say that. Certainly not anyone who's only 40. She folded her hands and gave a modest little smile. And that, my dears, was all I needed to know. Those dropped G's, Miss Marple said with a twinkle in her eye, sounded to me like a woman trying a bit too hard, playing a part, and not very naturally, overdoing it just a touch. She smiled, just a bit coyly. I shan't repeat what Mr. Patrick said to that, but I will say he was awfully complimentary. And though I never liked to seem vain, I couldn't help feeling, just the tiniest bit pleased with myself. She paused, her voice growing softer with affection. And isn't it funny how things work out? Mr. Rhodes, well, he married again. A lovely, sensible young woman. And now they've got the sweetest little baby. Miss Marple's eyes lit up, her voice full of gentle joy. And would you believe it? They asked me to be the godmother. Wasn't that kind of them? It touched me very deeply. She folded her hands in her lap and looked around, almost shyly. But I do hope I haven't gone on too long. And then, in a voice more dramatic, full of theater and pride, another woman broke in. The end, announced Jane Haley as she turned from her little audience. Strange Jest by Agatha Christie, and this, she added with flourish, was Miss Marple. Jane, being an actress, knew exactly how to land a final moment. Her voice rang with just the right mix of reverence and triumph, as if she had introduced not just a story, but a legend. And what was so curious, so delightfully ironic, was that the figure standing there, the source of all this awe, was simply a soft-spoken, white-haired lady, gentle, unassuming, with a twinkle behind her spectacles. Just an elderly spinster, fuzzy around the edges, with a kind face and modest air. The two young people who had just been introduced, thanks to Jane's enthusiastic efforts, looked stunned, slightly unsure, even a little dismayed. They had expected someone else. They were both lovely, of course. The girl, Charmian Stroud, was slim, striking, and dark-haired. But the cleverest woman in the room, they would soon learn, was the one who looked like she might offer you tea and a biscuit before quietly solving a murder. The young man, Edward Rossiter, was a tall, fair-haired, gentle-looking fellow with the easy charm of someone who'd never had to try too hard to be liked. Beside him, the dark-haired girl, Xiomara, looked a little breathless, not from exertion, but from nerves. She smiled warmly, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "Oh, we're so pleased to meet you," she said quickly, but her glance darted sideways, questioning, toward Jane. Jane caught it instantly and responded with the bright confidence of someone utterly sure of her promise. "Darling," she said with flair, "she's absolutely marvelous. Leave it all to her." She turned to Miss Marple, beaming. "I told them I'd get you here, and I have." Miss Marple, seated comfortably with her hands folded in her lap, turned her gentle china blue eyes to Mr. Rossiter and smiled. "Well now," she said pleasantly, "won't you tell me what all this is about?" Xiomara, still a little flustered, broke in quickly. "Jane's a friend of ours, and well, Edward and I, we're in a bit of a situation." "A fix," Jane interrupted, with dramatic flair. "They're in a fix, and I told them if they came to my party, I'd introduce them to someone who could help." Edward stepped in, trying to sound casual, but clearly a little out of his depth. "Jane says you're, well, the last word in solving things." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with amusement, but she waved the praise away modestly. "Oh, no, nothing of the sort," she said, with a light laugh. "It's just that, well, living in a village, one sees rather a lot of life. One learns how people think, how they behave when they think no one's watching." She leaned forward slightly, her voice warm and inviting. "But really, you've made me quite curious. Do tell me your problem." She paused, smiling. "Though I must warn you, people always think their troubles are terribly ordinary until they're not." "Buried treasure," Edward said with a sheepish grin. Miss Marple's eyes lit up with delight. "Buried treasure? My goodness, that does sound terribly exciting, like something out of Treasure Island." Edward chuckled. "I wish it were that thrilling. Unfortunately, our version has none of the romance. No weathered maps with skulls and crossbones. No poetic instructions like 4 paces west by north, turn at the twisted tree. It's all horribly dull, really." "No clues at all?" Miss Marple asked, genuinely intrigued. "Oh, we've tried," Edward said, running a hand through his hair. "We've dug up about 2 acres of land between us. At this point, the whole estate looks like it's preparing to become a rather sad vegetable patch. We were just deciding whether to grow marrows or potatoes," Xiomara added dryly. Then, quite suddenly, she leaned forward, her voice soft but earnest. "Miss Marple, may we really tell you the whole story?" Miss Marple gave her a reassuring smile. "Of course, my dear. Let's find somewhere a little quieter, shall we?" With that, Xiomara took Edward's hand and led the way out of the crowded, smoky room, up the narrow staircase, and into a cozy little sitting room on the 2nd floor, a warm, sunlit space that smelled faintly of lavender and old books. Once they were all seated, Xiomara took a breath and began, her voice more serious now. "Well, here goes. It starts with Uncle Matthew. Or rather, great-great-Uncle Matthew to both of us," she said, glancing at Edward. "He was ancient, truly ancient. One of those people who always looked like they came straight out of another century. But he was fond of us," Edward added quietly. "We were his only family, really. He always said, quite clearly and many times, that when he passed, everything would come to us equally. And then," Xiomara continued, "he died. Last March. And he did leave everything to us, just as he'd said. She paused, her brow furrowed slightly. But that is where the real mystery begins. Edward and I, well, what I just said might have sounded a little unfeeling, Xiomara began gently. I didn't mean it that way. We were genuinely fond of Uncle Matthew. Really, we were. It wasn't that we wanted him gone or anything like that. She paused, glancing at Edward for reassurance. It's just, he'd been ill for quite some time, and we'd made peace with what was coming. But the real shock, when it happened, was that everything he left behind turned out to be practically nothing, and that, honestly, was a bit of a blow to us both. Edward nodded slowly, his voice soft and earnest. You see, we'd counted on it. I know that sounds terrible, but when you grow up knowing you're going to inherit something one day, something substantial, you don't exactly buckle down and start building a fortune from scratch. I'm in the army, he added, half smiling, and apart from my pay, there's not much else to speak of. Edward's being modest, Xiomara said, smiling faintly. And me, I'm a stage manager in a repertory theater. The work is fascinating, and I love it, but there's absolutely no money in it. She looked down for a moment, then lifted her gaze to Miss Marple. We'd always planned on marrying. It wasn't even a question. And we weren't worried about the financial side of things because, well, we both thought we'd be quite comfortable someday. Her voice softened. And now, we're not. Not at all. She leaned forward slightly, more serious now. What makes it worse is the house, Anstace. That's the family place. It's old and it's beautiful, and we both love it with all our hearts. But without Uncle Matthew's money, we'll have no choice. We'll have to sell it. Edward reached over and quietly took her hand. And that, Xiomara said quietly, is something we just can't bear. Edward gave a small laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. You know, Charmian, we still haven't even gotten to the real point. Charmian looked at him and nodded. Then you tell it. Edward turned to Miss Marple, his voice calm but weighted with meaning. It's like this. As Uncle Matthew got older, he started becoming, well, suspicious of everything, of everyone. Miss Marple nodded knowingly. Very wise of him, she said, with a spark of dry humor. The depravity of human nature never fails to amaze. Edward smiled faintly. You may have a point. Uncle Matthew certainly thought so. One of his oldest friends lost everything in a bank crash. Another was ruined by a solicitor who vanished overnight. And Uncle Matthew himself had a bad experience. He lost money in some shady investment scheme. After that, something changed. Charmian added softly, he used to go on and on about it, said the only truly safe thing to do was to convert all your money into bullion, gold, and bury it. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Ah, she said, her voice light but alert. Now we're getting somewhere. Edward nodded. People tried to reason with him, told him it was absurd, that he'd lose out on interest, but he didn't care, said interest didn't matter, not when the world was full of cheats and thieves. The bulk of your fortune, Charmian quoted, should be kept in a box under your bed or buried in the garden. Miss Marple gave a thoughtful little nod, her fingers tapping together in her lap. And when he passed, Charmian continued, her voice tinged with both hope and frustration, he left almost nothing in securities, barely anything in the bank. Edward leaned forward. But we know he was wealthy, very wealthy. So we're convinced he must have done it. He must have hidden the money, in cash, or gold, somewhere. And that's what we're hoping to find, Charmian said softly. He withdrew large sums, Edward said, his voice growing more solemn, and no one knows what he did with them. But honestly, everything points to him living out his principles, buying gold, and burying it somewhere. Charmian let out a soft sigh. He didn't leave a single note. No letter, no instructions, That's the most maddening part. Nothing. Edward leaned forward, his eyes distant with memory. He'd been unconscious for days near the end. But just before he died, he came to for a moment. He looked at both of us and gave this faint little chuckle, weak, but full of that same old mischief. Then he said, "You'll be all right, my pretty pair of doves." Edward paused, his voice catching slightly. And then he tapped his right eye, just once, winked, and that was it. He was gone. "Dear old Uncle Matthew," Charmian said softly, a sad smile on her face. Even in death, he couldn't resist being cryptic. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, her expression thoughtful. "He tapped his eye?" she repeated gently. Edward nodded quickly, his hope rising. "Yes. Does that mean anything to you? It made me think of an old story I read once, about something hidden inside a man's glass eye." "But Uncle Matthew didn't wear a glass eye," Charmian added. Miss Marple shook her head slowly. No, nothing springs to mind. Not just yet." Her voice was kind, but honest. "I'm afraid I'm not quite a conjurer, my dear." Xiomara let out a quiet sigh of disappointment. "It's just, Jane told us you'd be able to look at us and know exactly where to dig." Miss Marple's lips curved in a soft smile. "Oh, I do wish it were that simple. But I never knew your uncle, not really. Not the kind of man he was deep down. And I've never seen the house or the land. And such things matter a great deal." She paused, then added kindly, "But don't worry. If your Uncle Matthew left a clue, even a strange one, we'll find it. Sometimes the heart of a mystery is not in what's written, but in what's felt." "If you did know the grounds," Charmian said, her voice laced with frustration, "then surely it would all be quite simple, wouldn't it?" "Simple?" Miss Marple repeated gently, her eyebrows lifting in quiet amusement. Xiomara gave a little huff, half exasperated, half defeated. "Then come down to Anstace and see if it feels simple." It's possible she didn't mean the invitation entirely seriously, more an expression of weary disbelief than an actual offer. But Miss Marple sat up, eyes bright with unmistakable enthusiasm. "Well, really, my dear," she said briskly, "that's very kind of you. I've always longed for a proper chance to hunt for buried treasure." Then, with a little twinkle in her eye and a smile straight out of a sun-drenched Victorian summer, she added, "And with a bit of a love story, too. Well, how perfectly delightful." They had just finished giving her the grand tour of Anstace, or what was left of it. The kitchen garden looked as though it had been through a war, every bed trenched and turned over like the aftermath of a storm. They had wandered through the little woods, where the roots of dignified old trees now sat awkwardly exposed, as if shivering in surprise. The one smooth stretch of lawn, once ideal for tea tables and croquet, was now a pitted landscape, like a forgotten battlefield. They had clambered up to the attic, where trunks had been opened, drawers pulled out, and dust stirred from decades of quiet. Then down into the cellars, where cold stone floors bore the marks of flagstones reluctantly pried from their beds. They had knocked on walls, measured every alcove and recess, and tapped hopefully at plaster as though treasure might sing back in reply. And Miss Marple, unfazed by it all, had been shown every last antique chair and hollow-legged cabinet, all suspicious in turn, all disappointingly empty. Still, she listened, watched, and smiled, the sort of smile that said she was taking it all in, even if she hadn't spoken a word just yet. They had examined everything. Every cabinet, every antique chest, every suspicious-looking table leg that might conceal a secret drawer had been investigated. Nothing had escaped their hopeful scrutiny. And now, in the morning room, There sat a small mountain of papers on the table. Bills, bank statements, letters, invitations, and endless personal correspondence. Every scrap of paper the late Matthew Stroud had ever filed or forgotten. Not a single sheet had been destroyed. Charmian and Edward had combed through them repeatedly, as if maybe, just maybe, some overlooked phrase, a scribbled margin note, a half-forgotten list, might offer a key to the treasure he had supposedly hidden. Time and again they returned to those papers, tired eyes scanning the same lines with fresh hope. "Can you think of anywhere we haven't looked?" Charmian asked Miss Marple, her voice tinged with equal parts hope and desperation. Miss Marple paused, then shook her head gently. "You've certainly been very thorough, my dear. Perhaps." She looked at them both with a thoughtful smile. "Perhaps just a little too thorough." They blinked at her, puzzled. "I always say," Miss Marple continued, folding her hands neatly in her lap, "that it's terribly important to have a plan. Otherwise you risk, well, polishing all the wrong places." She smiled as a memory came to her. "It's like my dear friend Mrs. Eldridge had a delightful little maid, so conscientious. Polished the linoleum beautifully. Too beautifully, in fact. She polished the bathroom floor until it shone like glass. And poor Mrs. Eldridge, stepping out of her bath, the cork mat just shot out from under her. She broke her leg, you know. Quite a nasty break." Charmian gasped softly, while Edward winced in sympathy. "Most awkward." Miss Marple added matter-of-factly, "The bathroom door was locked, of course, and the gardener had to fetch a ladder and climb through the window." She gave a small, rueful shake of her head. "Thoroughness is all well and good, but sometimes a little too much polish hides the thing you're actually meant to see." "It was terribly upsetting for poor Mrs. Eldridge," Miss Marple added softly, her expression touched with concern. "She was always such a modest woman. The very idea of being carried out of the bath by the gardener, through the window no less, quite crushed her spirit for weeks." Edward shifted restlessly in his chair, a flicker of impatience across his face. Miss Marple noticed at once and leaned forward gently. "Oh, please forgive me," she said kindly. "I do tend to ramble sometimes. I know I go flying off on tangents. But you see, one thing often reminds me of another, and, just now and then, those odd little memories help bring the real picture into focus." She smiled, a little apologetically. "All I meant to say is that perhaps we need to stop digging and start thinking again. A likely place, not just any place." Edward let out a small sigh, both amused and tired. "Then you'll have to do the thinking for us, Miss Marple," he said. "Charmian and I, well, our minds are completely blank. Nothing but soft, beautiful fog." Charmian laughed, though it was tinged with weariness. "It's true. I think we've exhausted all logic." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Well, let's just see what we do have, shall we?" She turned toward the pile of papers on the table. "If you don't mind," she said gently, "I'd like to look through these. That is, if there's nothing personal here. I'd hate to be thought nosy." "Oh, that's perfectly all right," Charmian said, waving a hand. "But I'm afraid you won't find anything. We've been over them again and again." Still, Miss Marple sat down, neatly smoothing her skirt beneath her, and began to go through the papers with quiet focus. She handled each sheet with care, sorting them into little piles, bills, letters, receipts, tidying as she went, as though even order itself might coax out the truth. When she reached the bottom of the stack, she leaned back slightly, her eyes going soft and far away. For a few long moments, she didn't say a word, just sat there, still and thoughtful. Edward raised an eyebrow. "Well, Miss Marple," he asked, his tone light, but not without a hint of teasing curiosity. Miss Marple blinked, as if waking from a dream. "Oh, I beg your pardon," she said, gently touching her fingertips together. "I was just thinking." Edward leaned forward, hopeful. "Have you found something useful?" Miss Marple smiled gently and shook her head. "Oh, no, nothing of that kind. No hidden map or secret message, I'm afraid. But I do think I've begun to understand what sort of man your Uncle Matthew really was." Her voice grew softer, more reflective. "He reminds me so very much of my own Uncle Henry. Rather a character. I imagine your uncle was quite fond of obvious little jokes. A bachelor, of course. I wonder why that was. Perhaps there was once a disappointment in love. So many dear old bachelors have had their hearts quietly broken in youth." Behind her, Charmian shot Edward a quick look and raised her eyebrows. The unspoken message between them was clear. She's completely dotty. But Miss Marple remained undisturbed, contentedly lost in memory. "My Uncle Henry," she went on, "was absolutely devoted to puns. Found them terribly amusing. 'This coffee is very Moorish,' he would say after dinner. Meaning, of course, he'd like a second cup." It drove Aunt Letitia to distraction. She gave a soft chuckle and continued, "He was a very suspicious man, too. Always certain the servants were stealing from him. And occasionally, I admit, they were. But by the end, it had quite consumed him. He refused to eat anything but boiled eggs. Said no one could tamper with the inside of a boiled egg." She looked wistful for a moment. "Poor dear, he used to be so full of cheer. Life just wore him down a bit, I suppose." Her voice was fond, nostalgic, but behind the warmth was something else, something quietly ticking. Observing, connecting. Edward felt his patience fraying. If he heard one more story about dear old Uncle Henry, he thought he might actually lose his mind. But Miss Marple was still meandering happily through her memories. "He was very fond of young people, you know," she said with a soft smile. "Though he did like to tease them a bit, in that way some older gentlemen do. He'd put a bag of sweets just out of reach on a shelf and watch the poor child struggle for it, all in good fun, of course." Charmian, clearly losing her charm, cut in, her tone a little too sharp. "I think that sounds horrible." "Oh no, my dear," Miss Marple said, unbothered. "Just a lonely old bachelor who never quite learned how to be gentle with children. He didn't mean any harm." She leaned back slightly, lost in recollection again. "He wasn't stupid either. Used to keep quite a lot of money in the house and insisted on having a special safe installed. Made quite the song and dance about how secure it was. Bragged endlessly." She chuckled quietly. "And of course, as these things go, burglars came in one night and cut the safe open with some dreadful chemical device." "Served him right," muttered Edward dryly. "Oh, but there was nothing in the safe," Miss Marple said with twinkling eyes. "He never actually used it, just a decoy. He hid the real money behind some rather dusty volumes of sermons in the library. Told me once, no one ever reads sermons unless they're terribly pious or terribly bored." Edward sat up suddenly, his eyes lighting up. "Wait, the library. That's an idea." But Charmian shook her head before the spark could ignite. "Don't be silly. Do you think I didn't think of that already?" she snapped, arms crossed. "I went through every single book last Tuesday while you were off gallivanting in Port's End." Charmian threw her hands up. "I took every book off those shelves myself," she said, exasperated. "Opened every single one, shook out the pages, even checked inside the dust covers. There was nothing, absolutely nothing." Edward let out a long sigh, part defeat, part apology, and got to his feet, clearly preparing to draw the visit to a close. He tried to sound gracious, but there was a weariness beneath the politeness. "It's really been awfully kind of you, Miss Marple, coming all this way and giving it your time. I'm only sorry it's turned out to be such a complete washout. I know we've imposed rather a lot on you. I'll get the car. You'll just catch the 3:30 if we hurry." But Miss Marple, unruffled and cheerful, blinked up at him as if he'd said something rather silly. "Oh, but my dear boy," she said with a warm smile, "we haven't found the money yet. Surely you're not giving up. Mr. Rossiter, if at first you don't succeed, try, and try again. That's always been my motto, or at least one of them." Edward blinked. "You mean you're going to keep trying?" "Why, strictly speaking," Miss Marple said, with a mischievous twinkle, "I haven't started yet. As Mrs. Beeton says in her lovely cookery book, first catch your hare. Such a splendid volume. Though really rather expensive. Most of her recipes begin with things like, take a dozen eggs and a pint of cream, which is hardly practical for most households. But where was I?" She paused, tapped a thoughtful finger to her chin. "Ah, yes. So, we've caught our hare, so to speak. The hare being, of course, your dear Uncle Matthew. Now we've only to decide where the clever old thing hid his treasure. I do believe," said Miss Marple gently, "that your uncle would have hidden the money somewhere perfectly simple." "Simple?" Charmian repeated, sounding almost insulted. "Oh yes, dear, quite sure of it," Miss Marple replied calmly. "The most obvious thing, you see, that's usually what people overlook. A secret drawer? That's what I'd wager." Edward gave a dry little laugh. "You couldn't exactly hide gold bars in a secret drawer." "Oh, no, of course not," Miss Marple agreed, with a slight wave of her hand. "But then, I don't believe there's any reason to think it was gold. People like your uncle and my dear Uncle Henry, come to think of it, they said things like that about keeping their wealth in gold. But it was often just a bit of misdirection. Diamonds now, that would be far more sensible. Small, valuable, easily hidden. And yes, a secret drawer would do nicely for those." Charmian looked disheartened. "But we did look. We even had a cabinet maker come in. He went over all the furniture, inch by inch." Miss Marple brightened. "Very clever of you, dear, very clever indeed. But tell me, your uncle's own desk, that tall escritoire against the wall, was that looked at closely? If I were hiding something precious, that's where I'd put it. Nothing so personal as one's writing desk. This one?" Charmian moved quickly toward it. "Let me show you." She pulled down the flap to reveal a neat set of pigeonholes and little drawers. With a practiced hand, she opened a small central compartment and pressed a tiny spring hidden inside the left drawer. With a faint click, the base of the center section shifted forward. "There," she said, sliding it out to reveal a hidden well beneath. They all leaned in. It was empty. "Well now, isn't that a funny little coincidence?" Miss Marple exclaimed with a delighted gleam in her eye. "My Uncle Henry had a desk exactly like this one. Of course, his was burr walnut, far more flamboyant than this rather serious mahogany, but the mechanism's just the same." Charmian gave a small sigh, part impatience, part resignation. "Be that as it may, there's clearly nothing here. We've checked it thoroughly, and it's empty." Miss Marple didn't seem the least discouraged. Yes, but I suspect your cabinet maker was a modern sort of young man. Very competent, no doubt, but some of the older craftsmen were extraordinarily clever, almost too clever. There's a secret, and then there's a secret within a secret, you know." With surprising agility, she reached up to her silvery bun and extracted a single hairpin. She straightened it expertly, then poked it gently into what looked like no more than a tiny blemish, perhaps a wormhole, in the side of the compartment. There was a soft, almost reluctant click. Then, with a careful tug, Miss Marple slid out a hidden drawer no one had suspected. Inside lay a bundle of faded letters, tied with a pale ribbon, and a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. Charmian and Edward pounced like children on Christmas morning. Edward, with trembling fingers, unfolded the paper, only to recoil instantly with a snort of disappointment. "It's a damn cookery recipe," he said bitterly. "Baked ham of all things." While he was grumbling, Charmian had slipped the ribbon off the letters. Her eyes flicked over the first page, widening in surprise. There, love letters! Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, and she let out a soft, prim gasp, her tone laced with cheerful Victorian scandal. "Oh, how very interesting! That might just explain why your uncle never married." Charmian, now half amused and half fascinated, began to read aloud. "My ever dear Matthew." Charmian smoothed the fragile sheet of paper in her hands and began to read aloud, her voice growing soft with curiosity. "I must confess that the time seems long indeed since I received your last letter. I try to fill my days with the duties expected of me and remind myself often how fortunate I am to see so much of the world. And yet, when I first set foot in America, I never imagined I would end up on such distant islands as these." She paused, brow furrowing slightly. "Where's this from?" Her eyes scanned the top of the letter. "Oh, Hawaii," she continued, her tone shaded with surprise. "These natives are still very far from seeing the light. They remain unclothed and unconverted, and spend most of their time swimming and dancing, adorning themselves with flowers." Charmian gave a small, half-shocked laugh. "Well, that's colonial modesty for you." Miss Marple, ever placid, only smiled faintly as Charmian went on. "Mr. Gray has made some converts, but it is uphill work. He and Mrs. Gray often grow discouraged, and I do my best to cheer them, though I too have known deep sadness, for a reason you well understand, dear Matthew. Your renewed vows and protestations of love gave me great comfort. Always and forever, you have my faithful and devoted heart. Yours in love and hope, Betty Martin P." Charmian laid the letter down slowly, her fingers still resting on the delicate paper, as though reluctant to let it go. "She loved him," she said softly. "She really loved him." Miss Marple nodded, her voice equally gentle. "Yes, and it sounds like she never stopped. Poor Miss Betty, so far away, wrapped in duty and longing. And your Uncle Matthew? I wonder if he ever wrote back." There was a quiet stillness in the room for a moment, the kind that follows an echo from another time. "On sending this letter under cover to our dear mutual friend, Matilda Graves, as usual." Charmian read aloud, her voice tinged with intrigue. "I do hope heaven will forgive this little deception." Edward let out a low whistle, shaking his head. A missionary, so that was Uncle Matthew's great love? Who would have guessed? Charmian, eyes still scanning the letters, murmured, "She really did travel everywhere, didn't she? Mauritius, the Pacific, all kinds of far-flung places. Maybe she died of yellow fever or some tropical illness." There was something wistful in her voice, as if picturing Betty Martin, devout and devoted, fading away in some sun-drenched place. A soft, almost delighted chuckle broke the silence. It was Miss Marple. Her blue eyes sparkled behind her spectacles as she held up an old paper, clearly amused. "Well, well," she said, "how extraordinary." She was reading aloud, but not another love letter. "Baked ham with spinach. Take a nice piece of gammon, stud it with cloves, cover generously with brown sugar, and bake in a slow oven. Serve with a border of pureed spinach." Seeing their bewildered looks, she added, "What do you think of that now?" Edward made a face. I think it sounds disgusting. Oh no, Miss Marple said cheerfully. Properly made, it's quite delicious. But that's not what I meant. Charmian's brows lifted. Then, what did you mean? A sudden glint of excitement lit Edward's face. You don't think, could it be a code? Some sort of cryptogram? He grabbed the paper eagerly. Come on, Charmian. Think about it. Who hides a recipe in a secret drawer unless it's hiding something else? Exactly, said Miss Marple, tapping the corner of the paper. Very, very significant indeed. Xiaomi suddenly sprang to life, her eyes wide. Wait, I know what it could be. Invisible ink, she cried. Quick, let's try it. She darted over to the electric fire and flipped it on, holding the mysterious recipe just above the gentle heat. Edward leaned in beside her, his face alight with anticipation. But after a few moments, nothing. The paper remained as bland and innocent as before. No hidden message, no magical words appearing. Miss Marple gave a soft, amused little chuckle. I do think, she said gently, that you may be trying a bit too hard. The recipe isn't the message. It's more like a nudge in the right direction, a clue in itself. But the key, I believe, is in the letters, especially. She trailed off, her eyes twinkling, the signature. But Edward, in his excitement, barely caught her words. He had seized one of the letters. Charmian, come here. She's on to something. Look at this. The paper's old, but the ink, it's fresh. These weren't written long ago at all. Charmian gasped. You're right. They're made to look ancient, but they're not. Exactly, Miss Marple said, her voice filled with quiet certainty. They're only pretending to be old. I would wager good tea and a slice of seed cake that dear Uncle Matthew wrote them himself. A hoax? Edward asked, stunned. But why? Not a hoax, Miss Marple said kindly, folding her hands with satisfaction. A puzzle, a final, fond little joke. There never was a missionary named Betty Martin. No romance. Just a man having his fun. The two stared at her, finally silent, finally listening. Miss Marple smiled warmly. You're holding it in your hands, my dears. The treasure. It's right there. Charmian blinked. You mean? Miss Marple nodded. Yes. That is the money. Xiaomi stared at the letter in her hand, her brows furrowed in growing wonder. The signature, she murmured. It gives everything away, doesn't it? Her voice had dropped to a hush, as if the paper itself might whisper back. Miss Marple nodded gently. Yes, dear. The recipe, with all its cloves and brown sugar, it's just a little nudge, a joke, really. But look again at what it's for, gammon and spinach. Charmian blinked. But what does that mean? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. It's an old-fashioned saying, dear. It means nonsense. Gammon and spinach, a dish of pure nonsense. Your uncle was telling you, in his own delightfully roundabout way, that the letters were never real, the food's fake, the story's a lie. But inside the lie lies your truth. Edward gave a low whistle. So the letters? Yes, said Miss Marple. They're what matters. And think, what did your uncle do just before he died? He tapped his eye. You told me that yourself. Xiaomi leaned forward slowly. He tapped his eye. Miss Marple smiled fondly, as if she were coaxing a child toward a secret surprise. Oh, my eye and Betty Martin, she said softly. There was silence for a breath. Then Edward gasped, the letter trembling in his hand. Of course, Betty Martin. That old saying, there is no Betty Martin. She's part of a nonsense phrase. Miss Marple nodded. Quite right, Mr. Rossiter. Betty Martin never existed. The name, the letters, the romance, it was all your uncle's little game. He wrote them himself, wrapped them in sentimental fancy, and hid them away. I dare say he had the most wonderful time doing it. Edward looked down again. And the envelope I'm holding, it's postmarked 1851. It couldn't possibly belong to this letter. Exactly, said Miss Marple, folding her hands primly in her lap. Your uncle was having a laugh. And now you've found not just the joke, but the answer. Miss Marple paused, letting the silence settle like dust in an old library. Then she repeated, with a little nod for emphasis, 1851. She looked from Edward to Charmian as though it should all be perfectly clear by now. And that explains everything, doesn't it? Edward blinked. Not to me, he admitted helplessly. Well, of course not, said Miss Marple kindly. To be honest, it wouldn't mean a thing to me either if it weren't for my great-nephew Lionel. Such a darling little boy. Terribly earnest and absolutely besotted with stamps. He lives and breathes them. It was Lionel who told me all about the rare ones, those precious little squares of colored paper that fetch thousands at auction. She smiled to herself. He mentioned a discovery, a remarkable one, an 1851 blue 2-cent stamp. It sold for something like $25,000. Can you imagine? I do believe your uncle knew exactly what he was doing. I'd wager every one of these envelopes has a stamp just like that. Rare, valuable, hidden in plain sight, as they say in all the best detective novels. He probably bought them quietly through dealers, made sure no one would trace a thing. Edward gave a long, low groan. He sank onto a nearby chair and buried his face in his hands. Oh, God, he said. What is it? Asked Charmian, alarmed. Nothing. Just the sickening thought that, if Miss Marple hadn't been here, we'd have burned those letters. His voice cracked a little. Burned them, in a gentlemanly, respectful, utterly stupid kind of way. Miss Marple gave a little sniff. That, she said, with a touch of dry amusement, is exactly what gentlemen do, and what these mischievous old bachelors never take into account when they hide things in silly ways. My Uncle Henry once hid a diamond brooch inside a Christmas pudding. Nobody ever found it until Aunt Agnes bit down and nearly lost a molar. She chuckled fondly. They do so love their jokes, don't they? My Uncle Henry, Miss Marple continued with a faraway smile, once gave his niece a 5-pound note for Christmas. Only, being who he was, he decided to hide it. She chuckled softly. He slipped it inside a card, sealed it up tight with gum, and wrote inside, Love and best wishes. Afraid this is all I can manage this year. She paused for effect. Well, the poor girl read it, saw no money, and thought he was being stingy. Outraged, she tossed the card straight into the fire. Miss Marple gave a little sigh, amused and exasperated all at once. He had no choice, of course, but to give her another 5-pound note. It served him right, and yet it was so very him. Edward stared at her for a beat, and then, with a sudden gleam in his eye, declared, Miss Marple, I'm going downstairs this instant to fetch a bottle of champagne. He turned to Charmian, grinning like a schoolboy. We're going to drink to the memory of her Uncle Henry, the most maddening, marvelous, mischief-making old man I never had the pleasure to meet. Miss Marple blushed faintly and folded her hands with quiet dignity, but her eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. And that, my dear, was the end.